Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Have you ever felt the weight of a place, heavy with memories that no longer seem to belong? I don't know why I found myself walking down this abandoned street, its broken buildings standing like husks of some forgotten civilization. Maybe I was looking for something, an answer, a meaning, or perhaps I just wanted to get lost for a while, far away from the buzz of the city, where it seemed everything had lost its color. But what I found was something much darker. The buildings on either side of me stood in ruin, their glass windows shattered like forgotten promises. The walls were cracked, peeling, their once vibrant paint faded, now just a memory of life that had once inhabited this space. What had happened here? What dreams had been crushed beneath the weight of time? I walked deeper into the desolate area, my boots crunching on the broken asphalt beneath my feet. There was a strange stillness in the air, like the whole world was holding its breath. It should have been peaceful, but it wasn't. It was oppressive. Each step I took brought me closer to the wreckage of what had once been a towering building. The structure now lay in pieces, scattered debris like forgotten skeletons of a once thriving place. The silence was deafening, yet something lurked beneath it. It wasn't just the absence of life, it was the absence of hope. It was as if the very air here had absorbed the sorrow of the past, and now it hung around me, suffocating, relentless. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It started with a faint rustling sound behind me. I turned quickly, but all I saw was the same empty street, stretching on, untouched. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was my imagination. I didn't know. But the feeling persisted. Something was watching me, lurking just beyond my vision. I pushed the thought away and continued forward, my eyes scanning the ground. The shattered pieces of glass, concrete, and twisted metal looked almost intentional, as if they had been placed to tell a story of their own. I stepped carefully around the debris, but then something caught my eye, a small object buried beneath the rubble. I bent down to pick it up, dusting it off. It was an old, rusted key, its metal darkened with age, worn smooth from years of neglect. What could it have unlocked? A door, a secret, a memory lost in time? The key felt heavy in my hand, its cold touch almost as if it had a life of its own. I stood up, my heart rate quickening. Something about it felt wrong, like I had just unearthed a part of something that shouldn't be disturbed. As I looked around, I noticed something else, something darker, something that couldn't be ignored. A faint smell, sharp and metallic, lingered in the air, just enough to make my stomach churn. It was familiar, but I couldn't place it. And then a shadow moved across the building in front of me, just at the corner of my vision. A quick flicker. No more than a trick of the light, I told myself. But even as I convinced myself of that, I couldn't help but wonder, what if it wasn't? The quiet rustling came again, closer this time. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. But the sense of being followed, watched was growing stronger, more palpable. My feet began to move faster, quicker than I had intended, and yet, no matter how much ground I covered, the oppressive stillness seemed to follow, pressing against me from all sides. I turned the corner and found myself facing another building, this one even more decayed than the rest, its walls leaning precariously, threatening to collapse at any moment. But it wasn't the crumbling structure that caught my attention. It was the feeling. The feeling that this was where it all began, the place where everything had started to unravel. The remnants of a sign lay across the entrance, half buried in the rubble. I stepped closer, brushing the debris away to reveal the faint letters. They were faded, barely legible, but there was no mistaking it. This had once been a school. I stared at the word school for a long time, the letters almost mocking me. There was something haunting about the idea of school, once a place of learning, growth, and hope, now reduced to this. To ruins. What happened here? What happened to all the lives that had passed through these halls, to all the futures that had been shaped within these walls? The rustling sound came again, louder now, unmistakable. My heart raced, and I turned, my eyes scanning the shadows. There, in the corner of the building, a figure stood just out of reach of the dim light. I couldn't make out any details, just a shape cloaked in darkness and moving. I took a hesitant step forward, my pulse thundering in my ears. Hello? My voice cracked as I spoke, the words sounding too fragile in the air around me. No response. My feet felt frozen in place, but the figure remained still, its form indistinguishable from the shadows. Every instinct told me to run, to flee, but my body refused to obey. Something about this place, this moment, held me there, locked in its grip. The figure didn't move. It was just there, watching, waiting. And then, before I could even think to move, the sound came again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty street. They were coming toward me. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear them. Closer, and closer. A chill ran down my spine, my throat tightening as I fought to breathe. Something was coming. Something I was not meant to see. The footsteps were unmistakable, no, too real to ignore. Each step echoed in my chest like a hammer striking metal. But there was no one. Not a figure, not a shadow, just the sound of the invisible approaching, growing louder, closer, until I could almost feel the breath of whatever it was behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. Something told me that if I did, I might not be able to unsee it. I forced my legs to move, a reflex born from pure terror, but my feet felt heavy, sluggish. Every step felt like I was sinking into the earth itself. I reached the end of the alley, my eyes frantically scanning for an escape route. The ruins stretched endlessly in front of me, an ocean of broken walls and forgotten memories. But all I could hear was the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps behind me, the ground beneath me almost vibrating with each step they took. The smell of rust and decay was stronger now, sharp and metallic, like blood that had long since dried but still clung to the air. It wasn't just the buildings that felt abandoned, it was everything. The city itself felt hollow, like it had been forgotten by time itself. I turned to glance behind me. No one. Nothing but shadows. But the feeling that I wasn't alone, never had been alone, gripped me like a vice. I looked back at the building that had once been a school. The sight of it twisted something deep inside me, and I found myself taking slow, cautious steps toward it, as if drawn by an invisible force. There was something about this place that felt familiar, like I'd been here before. The scent of damp stone, the way the shadows pulled beneath the broken windows, it all felt too real. But it wasn't It couldn't be. This was just another ruin. Just another forgotten corner of the world. Or so I tried to convince myself. The door to the school, the one that should have been locked, bolted shut after years of neglect, was slightly ajar. It creaked in the wind, but the noise didn't fade. It lingered in the stillness, cutting through the air like the whisper of a memory. I don't know why I stepped inside. I should have turned back. I should have left. But my feet moved without my consent, as if the place was pulling me in, dragging me closer to something I wasn't meant to see. Inside, the air was thick, stagnant. The walls, though cracked and peeling, still carried traces of color, faint, washed-out remnants of what once had been vibrant murals. I could almost imagine the classrooms filled with children, their voices echoing off these walls, dreams blooming in their hearts. But that was long gone. The past was dead here, buried beneath years of neglect and decay. I walked deeper into the hallway, my steps muffled by the layers of dust that clung to the floor. My hand brushed against the wall, and I felt the rough texture of old paint under my fingers. The air grew colder as I moved further in, a sudden drop in temperature that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Then I heard it. A voice. Not a whisper, not a shout, but something in between, low, indistinct, like a murmuring presence barely audible but unmistakable. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice wasn't coming from one direction. It was coming from everywhere. I strained my ears trying to make sense of it. There was no pattern to the sound, no rhythm. Just words, muffled as though they were speaking from the other side of a thick wall. I turned in a circle, trying to find the source, but the wall seemed to close in on me, their shadows stretching like hands reaching for my throat. I took a step back, my foot catching on a pile of rubble that had fallen from the ceiling. I barely managed to stay upright, my pulse pounding in my ears. The voice grew louder, clearer now, and I realized it was coming from behind one of the doors. I didn't even want to open it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run, to get as far away from this place as I could. But something I couldn't explain kept me rooted to the spot. Curiosity. Fear? I couldn't tell anymore. With shaking hands, I reached for the door handle, half expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily as if waiting for me. The moment the door creaked open, a gust of cold air hit my face, making me gasp. Inside, the room was pitch black. I couldn't see a thing. The voices grew louder, a chorus of whispers in the darkness, too many to make sense of. Some more frantic, some calm, some filled with pain. But all of them carried the same desperate, pleading undertone. I stepped inside, my heart hammering in my chest, but the darkness swallowed me whole. My breath felt trapped in my throat as I fumbled for the light switch, but there was nothing, no way to push through the blackness surrounding me. Then something shifted. A shadow. At first, it was just a shape, an indistinct blur in the corner of my vision. But it moved. Slowly. Methodically. I could feel it, feel the weight of it pressing down on me, pushing me closer to the edge. My hand shook as I reached out, hoping, praying that the switch would work. But just before I could touch it, a voice or a scream ripped through the silence. Get out! It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a scream. A scream that tore through the walls of my mind and rattled my very soul. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I bolted out of the room, back into the hallway, but the darkness followed me, clinging to my every step. The footsteps were louder now, closer right behind me. I could feel the presence pressing against my back like a cold, invisible hand. The air thickened, choking me, and I felt my legs weaken under the pressure. The skull of this ruined place wasn't empty. It was alive. And it was hungry. My lungs burned, each breath a ragged gasp, my legs screaming for relief, but there was no stopping now. I had to move faster. I had to get out. The darkness didn't just cling to me, it chased me, a suffocating presence pushing me further into the heart of this decaying nightmare. I turned a corner, slamming into the brick wall of a collapsed hallway, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of whatever pursued me. But it wasn't just the darkness that had a hold of me now. The whispers, the voices, they were everywhere. They didn't just echo in my ears anymore, they seeped into my thoughts, twisting, distorting, pushing at the edges of my sanity. Leave. One of them breathed, soft but unmistakable. I stumbled forward, the air thickening as I pushed deeper into the ruin. The building, if you could still call it that, was no longer familiar. Every turn felt wrong. The walls seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, the angles never quite the same. The floor beneath my feet seemed to breathe, its old, creaky boards groaning with each step I took. The very structure of the place felt alive, if not physically, then in some intangible way. I could feel the weight of the lost lives within these walls pressing against me, as if every crack, every shattered window, every piece of broken brick carried the memories of the people who had once walked here. They were trapped here, bound to these ruins by some force that couldn't comprehend, their suffering echoing through the decay. My heart hammered in my chest, and I swallowed hard, trying to fight the rising panic. Was I going crazy? Was this real? But deep down, I knew it was. I could feel it. The energy in the air had shifted. It was as if the very building itself resented my presence. It wanted me out. No, not just out, it wanted me to leave in a way I couldn't fully understand, in a way that would leave me broken. The light from my phone flickered its weak beam, struggling to pierce the darkness, but it was the only source of clarity in a sea of shadows. The walls closed in on me, as if watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. The whispers grew louder. The cold wind swirling through the corridors was filled with words, no longer just soft murmurs, but distinct phrases, filled with pain and desperation. Help me, please. I froze. That voice. It was different from the others. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a cry. A cry that reached into the very core of my being, sending an icy chill down my spine. Help me, save me, the voice begged again. My mind screamed for me to ignore it. To keep moving, to not give in to whatever this was. But my feet felt rooted to the spot, my chest tightening, as if the voice was pulling me in, trapping me in its plea. Against my better judgment, I followed the voice. It wasn't irrational. I knew that. But I couldn't help myself. Something about the sorrow in that cry drew me forward. And so I walked. The hallway stretched out endlessly. In front of me, the doorways to classrooms now closed, their dark interiors like empty eye sockets, staring into nothing. I passed one, then another, the sensation of eyes following me intensifying with every step. The further I walked, the more the voice began to change. It grew distorted, stretched, like someone trying to speak through a long tunnel. Save me, it called, but the words weren't clear, lost in static, until I reached the last classroom on the right. I stopped in front of the door, the air so still it felt suffocating. My fingers twitched toward the handle, hesitation clawing at me. But I couldn't turn away now, not when the voice was so close, so desperate. I had to know. I turned the handle. The door swung open with an eerie creak, and I stepped inside. The room was pitch black, darker than any space I had encountered so far. But there was something different here, something wrong. It was the coldness that hit me first, an unnatural chill that made the air feel like ice. And then, the smell faint at first, but unmistakable once it registered. The smell of decay. Of something long dead. I stepped inside, the creaking floorboards beneath my feet protesting as I moved further into the room. The faint outline of old desks, the wood warped and cracked, appeared before me, shrouded in the darkness. And then I heard it again, the voice. But this time, it wasn't a plea. It was a laugh. A low, guttural chuckle. I froze. The sound was hollow, as if it came from deep within the earth. It reverberated off the walls, echoing in the room with a sickening resonance. I turned, my heart thudding in my chest. And then I saw it. In the far corner, near the broken window, stood a figure. A silhouette, barely visible in the shadows. Its form was human but wrong. It was tall, too tall, with arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally long, reaching out in my direction. Its face was obscured by darkness, but I could feel its eyes that pierced the blackness like twin burning coals. I could feel it stare, cold and empty, but full of some terrible intent. The laughter grew louder, more frantic. It was as if the figure was enjoying my fear, feeding off it. The figure's mouth open, stretching wide, too wide, impossibly so. And then I heard the words spoken in a voice that didn't sound like a voice at all. Welcome to the end. I bolted. I didn't look back. Every instinct screamed at me to escape, and for the first time since entering the ruins, my legs obeyed. But it was too late. The shadow moved swift and relentless. It was on me before I could even process what was happening, grabbing at my arms, its fingers like ice-cold iron. And then there was darkness. Complete. Total. Unyielding darkness. I tried to scream, but the sound never left my throat. The world around me vanished, swallowed by a cold so deep it felt like it had always been there. And as I drifted into the void, I could hear that same voice, soft and insistent. You are not leaving. The room faded into nothingness, and I was left with the echo of a single thought. What had I become? I woke up with a jolt, my eyes snapping open to a world I couldn't recognize. My surroundings were completely unfamiliar, empty, hollow. The room was bathed in a faint, unnatural light, flickering like a dying candle. It didn't feel like any place I had been before, not the classroom, not the ruins. This was something else entirely. My head threw up, pain pulsing through the fog of confusion. I reached up to touch my forehead, and my fingers met something wet and sticky. Blood? My heart raced in my chest, but there was no time to panic. I had to figure out where I was. How had I gotten here? What had happened to me? I forced myself to sit up. The room, if you could call it that, was a strange, warped version of something familiar. The walls were cracked, the floor scattered with debris, but nothing about it felt real. There was no decay, no dust, just that unsettling quiet that pressed in on me from all sides. A faint hum filled the air, as if the space itself was alive, breathing in slow, rhythmic pulses. I pushed myself off the ground, my legs unsteady. My shoes scraped against the cold floor, and the sound echoed in the silence. The door to the room was ajar, and I could see a dark hallway stretching out beyond it, its edges blurred and indistinct, as if the hallway itself was shying away from my gaze. I didn't want to go into the hallway. I could feel it. Something was waiting for me there, lurking just beyond my sight. But there was nowhere else to go. I had no choice. I moved toward the door, each step slow and deliberate. The hum grew louder, the sound vibrating in my chest. It was almost like it was pulling me in, coaxing me forward. As I crossed the threshold into the hallway, the light flickered, casting strange, twisted shadows against the walls. The shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching unnaturally, as if reaching out to touch me. I swallowed hard, trying to push the dread that was creeping up my throat back down. But the more I walked, the stronger the feeling became. The air was thick with the scent of something rancid, and every few steps I heard a soft shuffle behind me, like footsteps, but when I turned, there was nothing. Nothing but darkness, deeper and colder the further I went. I reached the doorway, and without thinking, I stepped inside. The room was larger than I expected. Its walls were covered in strange symbols I didn't recognize, but they seemed familiar, as though I had seen them before in a dream. The floor was covered in shattered glass, the remains of broken windows scattered across the ground like the remnants of something lost. But it wasn't the glass that caught my attention. It was the figure standing in the center of the room. Tall, gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and twisted, as though it had been distorted by some dark force. It was cloaked in shadows, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its presence. It wasn't just in the room, it was inside my mind, crawling beneath my skin, scraping against my thoughts. It moved toward me with unsettling grace, its steps barely making a sound on the glass-covered floor. It didn't speak, but I could hear its voice inside my head, a low, rasping whisper. "Welcome." The words seemed to reverberate in the room, echoing off the walls, filling every corner. It was cold, detached, and yet there was something so familiar about it. A memory, perhaps, from somewhere deep in the recesses of my mind. I stepped back, instinctively recoiling from the figure, but it was too late. It was already in front of me, its elongated fingers reaching out to touch my face, cold and smooth like polished marble. I flinched, my breath catching in my throat, but the figure didn't let go. It held me there, its touch both soothing and suffocating at the same time. "You've been here before," it whispered. I tried to pull away, but its grip was firm. Its voice wrapped around me, tightening like a noose. "You've always been here." The words didn't make sense. What did it mean? How could I have always been here? I had never seen this place before in my life. And yet, there was something buried deep in my mind, something I couldn't quite reach. It was as if the memories were just out of my grasp, slipping through my fingers like sand. The figure tilted its head, studying me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't just its appearance, or its words, it was the feeling that came with them. It was as though it knew everything about me, everything I had ever done, every mistake, every regret. And it was pleased to see me like this, broken and lost. "No, I don't remember." I stammered, my voice shaking. The figure smiled, but it wasn't a smile at all. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth, glistening in the dim light. It leaned in close, its cold breath brushing against my ear. "You will, soon enough." And then the world around me shifted. The walls of the room seemed to bend and twist, warping into something else. The floor buckled beneath my feet, and I staggered, struggling to keep my balance as the entire space seemed to distort, like a bad dream collapsing in on itself. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The figure was gone, and in its place was darkness pure, inky blackness that filled every inch of the room. I was trapped in it, suffocating in its cold embrace. My mind spun in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What was happening? Was this some kind of hallucination? Or was I truly lost in a place that didn't exist, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied? I couldn't trust my senses. Every corner of my mind screamed for answers, but all I found was more questions. And the deeper I delved, the further away the answers seemed to be. The darkness grew thicker, pulling me in, until I couldn't see anything at all. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it stopped. The room was still. I opened my eyes, unsure of what to expect. And that is when I saw it. The figure was standing before me once more, its face now clearly visible in the dim light. But it wasn't a face at all. It was my own. The realization hit me like a freight train. I wasn't just in this place. I was part of it, and it was never letting me go. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat as I stared at the twisted reflection of myself. The figure thing was an exact replica of me, yet there was something fundamentally wrong about it. Its eyes were hollow, devoid of any warmth or humanity, just empty pits that seemed to gaze directly into the core of my being. The face, no, it wasn't mine, not really. It was like my face had been stretched, distorted into something monstrous, something unrecognizable. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as it tilted its head slowly, mimicking my own frightened movements. And then it smiled. The smile was wide, far too wide, stretching unnaturally across its face, with grotesque mockery of any human expression. Its mouth was filled with rows of sharp, jagged teeth, like something from the deepest nightmares. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I instinctively stepped backward, my heart racing wildly in my chest. "Why are you?" I began, but the words caught in my throat, thick and suffocating. "You know why," the figure replied, its voice an eerie, distorted echo of mine, hollow and distant, as if the very words were coming from the darkened corners of my mind rather than from its lips. "You've always known." I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. It was as if the air itself had turned to stone, binding me to this moment, to this place. The room, no, the entire world around me felt as though it was collapsing, folding in on itself like an ancient book long forgotten. You aren't me," I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond right away. Instead, it moved closer, its every step unnaturally silent. The light around us flickered again, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to breathe, pulsating with an unseen force. The air was thick with a foul stench now, something metallic and bitter, like rusted iron and burning flesh. I gagged, stumbling backward, but there was nowhere to go. The walls of the room were closing in, tightening with an oppressive weight. The ceiling seemed to lower inch by inch, as if it were trying to crush me beneath its endless, suffocating pressure. The figure reached out, extending its long, thin fingers toward me. I could feel its presence before it even touched me, a cold, unnatural energy that rippled through the air, filling the space with a sense of dread so powerful it made my skin crawl. I tried to pull away, but the air was too thick, too heavy, and the figure's hand landed on my shoulder with an icy grip that sent a jolt of fear straight through me. "You've always been here," it repeated, its voice reverberating in my skull. "This is where you belong. We all belong here." Terror flooded my senses as I tried to tear myself away, but it was useless. I couldn't escape. The room was no longer a room, it was an abyss, an endless void that twisted and stretched into infinity. I could feel the darkness pressing against me, pushing in from all sides, suffocating any sense of hope or reason. The wall shifted, flickering in and out of existence, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Through the broken windows, I saw a distorted landscape, a world that seemed to stretch and melt, like the remnants of a forgotten dream. Buildings crumbled into nothingness, their once proud structures now reduced to rubble and ash. Streets that should have been familiar were unrecognizable, warped by time and decay. I was losing myself. I could feel it in my mind, my sense of who I was slipping away. The figure's grip tightened, pulling me closer to it, and with each passing second, I felt my identity unraveling. "You are nothing but a fragment," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "A broken piece of a shattered whole. You were never meant to leave. You can escape." "Ah!" I cried out, desperate, my voice raw with panic. "I am not like you." The figure's grin widened, impossibly so, until its face seemed to split in half. The sound of cracking bone echoed through the room, and I could feel the very air quiver with the tension of something about to break. But instead of pain, instead of fear, what I felt was acceptance. Something inside me snapped. I tore away from the figure's grip, stumbling backward, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't breathe. My lungs were on fire. But I couldn't stop moving. I ran around blindly through the darkness, the sound of my feet pounding against the floor drowned by the pounding of my own frantic heartbeat. The air shifted again, and I found myself in another room. This one was smaller, darker, with only a faint light coming from a cracked window. Through it, I could see the moon, full and bright, casting an eerie glow across the empty city outside. The wind howled, rattling the glass, but there was no sound in the room, just a dead, suffocating silence. I looked around, frantic, searching for anything that could help me make sense of this nightmare. The walls were covered in strange, cryptic symbols, their meaning just beyond my reach, teasing my mind with their twisted shapes. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, there was a mirror. It was cracked, shattered in places, but it still reflected the faintest light. I felt an overwhelming urge to look into it, though I knew I shouldn't. Something deep inside me warned me against it, but I couldn't resist. I approached it slowly, my reflection warping into broken glass. It was me, wasn't it? But there was something wrong. My face was twisted in agony, my eyes wild as though I had been here far too long. The reflection moved, but not as I did. It was too quick, too erratic. And then, with a sharp, violent crack, the reflection smiled. And I knew then that there was no escaping this place. The world around me had already been swallowed by the void, and there was only one truth left. I was trapped. Forever. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let us continue. Have you ever felt the fall of the season in your bones? As though each leaf that falls carries with it a piece of your soul, slowly, quietly, being drawn into the earth. The world outside was alive with the brilliant colors of autumn, but there was a heaviness in the air, a weight that made my chest tighten with each breath I took. The wind whispered secrets to me, secrets that I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. I walked alone through the forest, the golden leaves swirling around me, their fluttering sounds muffled by the thick silence of the woods. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the ground. The sky was a bruised shade of orange and purple, the setting sun leaving a cold touch on the landscape. It should have been peaceful, the beauty of the autumnal evening should have soothed me, but instead, it only seemed to press on my mind like an uncomfortable memory I couldn't quite grasp. There was something about this place that felt different, something off. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't the forest itself, it was the way the trees seemed to lean in, as though they were watching me. The rustling of the leaves, first gentle and calming, now sounded like a chorus of hushed whispers, voices that grew louder the deeper I ventured into the woods. I paused, heart hammering in my chest. The wind had died down for a moment, leaving only the occasional creak of branches swaying against each other. And then I heard footsteps. But they weren't mine. No, the sound was too deliberate, too heavy to belong to the light crunch of my own boots on the dry leaves. I spun around, my eyes scanning the path behind me. Nothing. The air was thick with the strange, cloying scent, something damp, earthy, like wet soil and decay. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It had to be the season, the way the air changed as the temperature dropped. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the air. I took another step forward, my mind racing. Why had I come here today? Why now, when the forest felt so alive with something I couldn't quite put into words? I had been here hundreds of times before, but today, the trees felt different. They felt like something else. I continued walking, the leaves crunching under my boots. Each step felt heavier, the ground sinking slightly with each movement, as if the earth itself was reluctant to let me go. The whispers came again, faint at first, like the wind playing tricks on my ears, but then louder, clearer. It was a voice calling my name. Sarah, Sarah. I froze. The voice was so clear, so real. It made my blood run cold. But that wasn't my name. No, it wasn't My name was Emily. I had been called that all my life. The name in the breeze was wrong. I turned quickly, searching for the source of the voice. But all I saw was the endless stretch of trees, the branches twisting and curling like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. A chill ran through me, not from the temperature but from the weight of something unseen, something far darker than the forest itself. Then a movement caught my eye. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure, just barely visible between the trunks of the trees. The shape was tall, slender, but I couldn't make out any defining features. The shadows seemed to cling to it, as if the darkness itself had taken form. I could feel my heart skip a beat, a knot forming in my stomach. My legs wanted to run, but I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed, frozen by an instinct I didn't understand. It stepped forward, its presence growing, filling the space around me like a thick fog. My mind screamed for me to turn and flee, but my feet remained glued to the ground. "Why are you here?" the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't coming from the air. It came from the figure itself. I couldn't speak. I couldn't answer. The figure took another step, and suddenly the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift. The earth was soft, like it was alive, as if the roots of the trees had begun to reach out and pull at me, trying to tether me to the earth. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, pressing down on me from all sides, like the very forest itself was closing in. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding as I turned to run. But the footsteps, those heavy, deliberate steps, followed me, echoing in the stillness of the forest. They were getting closer, too close. My lungs burned with the effort to run, but no matter how fast I moved, the sound of those footsteps never faded. I glanced over my shoulder. The figure was still there, moving with unnatural speed, closing the distance between us. It was no longer just a shadow in the trees. Now I could see it clearly, a tall, thin shape, its face pale and twisted, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into my soul. Its mouth opened in a wide grin, too wide, and I saw rows of teeth, sharp and broken, like fragments of bone. I screamed, my voice barely breaking through the suffocating air as I stumbled forward. The path ahead seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees warping and twisting around me as if they were trying to trap me, to bind me in their branches. Then, just as I thought I couldn't run any longer, the ground beneath me shifted again. I tumbled forward, falling hard against the forest floor. My vision blurred, my head spinning, but through the fog I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was standing over me now, towering like some ancient creature of the woods. Its face loomed closer, and I could feel the air grow colder, the very essence of the forest pressing against me. It leaned down and whispered, "This is where you belong." And then everything went black. I didn't know how long I was out. Time, in that dark forest, lost all meaning. When I opened my eyes, the world was still spinning, but this time, it wasn't the trees around me that felt oppressive. No, it was the silence. I could hear nothing at all. Not the wind, not the rustling of the leaves, not even the distant calls of birds or the crunch of animals moving through the underbrush. It was as though the world had stopped breathing. My body ached. My head pounded with each breath, a dull, relentless throb that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. I pushed myself up from the ground, my hands sinking into the damp earth. The air felt heavier than before, like it was thick with a suffocating weight. The smell was stronger now, sickly sweet, like something rotting just beneath the surface. I gagged at the stench, covering my nose with my sleeve, but it only seemed to make it worse. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady as though they had forgotten what it was like to move. The world around me seemed wrong. The forest, once familiar, now appeared distorted, twisted. The trees no longer stood tall and proud. Instead, they leaned in, and all branches stretching toward me like dark fingers. Their bark was slick, almost like blackened veins running through the trunks. It wasn't just the trees either. The ground itself seemed to pulse beneath me as though it was alive, breathing with a slow, relentless rhythm. A sharp, chilling gust of wind swept through the clearing, causing the leaves to rustle like whispers. But they weren't whispers of nature. These were darker, more insistent voices calling from the shadows, just out of reach. My heart skipped a beat. My instincts screamed at me to run, but where? Where could I run in a place that no longer felt like a place at all? I looked around, hoping for some sign of familiarity, something that might guide me out of this nightmare. But the path had vanished. There was no trail, no sense of direction. Only the endless stretch of trees, their twisted shapes and elongated shadows distorting reality, making me feel like I was walking in a dream I couldn't wake up from. The silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. And then I heard it again. That voice. But this time, it was closer. Emily. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. It was soft at first, like a breath of wind, but then it grew louder, more insistent, until it was almost a scream. Emily. I spun around, my eyes scanning the forest frantically, but there was nothing. Only darkness and the heavy weight of the air pressing down on me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming faster now. The voice, was it real? Or was I losing my mind? Emily, it came again, but this time the voice was different. It was distorted, twisted. Not a whisper, but a rasping, dry croak that sent chills down my spine. My legs moved before my brain could catch up. I ran, stumbling through the forest, my feet tripping over the uneven ground. The trees seemed to close in on me, the branches reaching out like claws trying to catch me, to hold me in place. The air grew colder as I ran, the darkness deepening with each step. I was no longer sure if I was running towards something or away from it. It didn't matter. I just had to keep moving. But the more I ran, the louder the voice became. Emily. I wanted to scream, to shout, to ask who was calling my name, but I couldn't hear. I was too terrified. My body was moving on its own, driven by pure instinct. My mind was losing its grip on reality. Was this some kind of hallucination? Had I hit my head too hard when I fell? Suddenly, I stopped. The trees had parted, revealing a clearing up ahead, but it wasn't like any clearing I'd ever seen before. The ground was covered in dark, wet leaves, and the air was thick with an oppressive stillness. The sky above was no longer the orange and purple hues of sunset, it was black, void of stars, as if the heavens themselves had abandoned this place. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone monument. It was ancient, its surface covered in moss and creeping vines. But it wasn't the monument itself that caught my attention. It was the figure standing before it. A figure like a shadow, moving in the middle of the clearing. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched unnaturally long. Its body was obscured in shadow, but I could feel its presence, could feel its gaze fixed upon me. Its head was turned towards me, and though I couldn't see its face, I knew it was watching me, studying me. Emily, the voice rasped again, but this time it was coming from the figure. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the earth, but it was as if the ground itself was pushing back against me. The wind howled in my ears, the leaves swirled violently around me, and I could hear the sound of something chasing me, something moving faster than I could ever run. The voice didn't stop. It followed me, growing louder, more frantic. Emily. I stumbled through the forest, but the trees seemed endless, the path impossible to find. The shadows were alive, twisting and writhing, reaching for me, and all I could do was keep running. But no matter how fast I moved, the presence was always there, just behind me, closer with each step. And then in the distance I saw it. A flicker of light. The faintest glow, cutting through the darkness. The path. An escape. But as I neared it, the light dimmed, flickered, and disappeared entirely. The forest was completely dark once more. I was lost. And I could feel the figure closing in. My legs were burning. The unrelenting sting of exhaustion was creeping up my spine, but I couldn't stop running. I couldn't slow down. The sensation of being pursued, of something inhuman breathing down my neck, was too much to ignore. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, felt like a predator closing in on me. And then it happened. The ground beneath me buckled. My foot caught on something hidden in the dark roots, rocks, or something else, and I went down hard. My palm scraped against the earth as I tried to brace myself, but it was useless. The world spun, and I tumbled into the dirt, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. I lay there for a moment gasping, trying to regain my bearings. My heart was still racing, but my body refused to move. I could feel the cold creeping into my bones as I tried to push myself upright, my hands trembling with every motion. There was no time for this. But as I stood, something caught my eye. The forest around me had changed. It wasn't just the trees, everything had shifted. The once sprawling woods, the thick underbrush, the familiar paths that led me home were gone. In their place was something far worse. The trees were now tall, like sentinels guarding something. Their trunks were smooth, almost translucent, as if they were made of glass or ice, the branches stretching upward into the sky like long, jagged fingers. But it wasn't just the appearance that unsettled me, it was the way they moved. Very slowly, imperceptibly so, but still they seemed to shift and sway toward me, like they were alive, their creaking sounds almost like whispers. And then I heard it again. The voice. Emily. This time it wasn't distant. It wasn't behind me. It was here. close. I spun around, heart hammering, but there was no one. Just shadows. Endless, dark shapes that seemed to blur and twist like smoke, forming and unforming with every heartbeat. Chill in the air was becoming unbearable, and my breath began to form clouds of mist in front of me. The temperature had dropped sharply. I turned back toward the clearing, toward the monument, desperate to find anything that would explain this madness. That is, when I saw it. The figure was standing near the monument again, but it wasn't he alone. Another figure had emerged from the darkness beside it, tall and pale, its body devoid of any real shape. Its outline shimmered as if made from mist or moonlight, its movements languid, like a slow dance in the wind. It didn't have a face, only the faintest suggestion of a head, an empty space where I should have been. The first figure stepped forward, its long, dark arms reaching out, its fingers gnawed and clawed like tree roots. The other followed, gliding eerily toward me. I felt the cold of their presence seeping into my skin. Each step they took felt as though the earth itself was pulling me down, trying to hold me in place. Emily. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a command. A summons. I didn't want to listen. I didn't want to obey. But something inside me stirred. Something primal, something ancient. And for a fleeting moment, I wondered, had I been called here? Had I always been meant to be here? The ground beneath my feet began to rumble softly, and I felt the pull, the urge to move toward them. But I resisted. I couldn't give in. Not yet. With every ounce of willpower, I forced my legs to carry me backward, stumbling on the uneven ground. The movement seemed to agitate the figures, as if they hadn't expected it, and they stopped just for a moment silent, waiting. The air thickened, charged with a heavy energy that made my skin crawl. Then the whispering began. It wasn't just one voice this time. There were dozens, hundreds layered on top of each other, indistinguishable from the next. They whispered my name, called me, begged me to come closer. But I couldn't I couldn't let go. Terror clawed at me from every direction, but the fear of what waited in the center of the clearing was far greater. What if I went toward it? Would I ever come back? Would I become part of the forest? What did it want? My eyes darted to the monument. It was no longer just a stone marker. Something had changed about it too. Its surface had grown darker, almost blackened, the moss around it beginning to crawl upward as if it were alive. The base of the stone was cracked wide open, and through the fissure I could see an unnatural glow of faint, greenish light flickering in the darkness, like the pulse of a heart beating in time with my own. I took a step backward, and the ground beneath me shifted again. This time there was no tripping, no falling. The earth opened up around me, as if the very forest was swallowing me whole. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the air, absorbed by the trees, and the sky above me began to darken further, the stars vanishing into the black void. And then I felt the pull. Stronger now. The force that had been growing ever since I stepped into this cursed place was undeniable. It wasn't just calling me, it was commanding me, wrapping its cold fingers around my soul, dragging me toward the monument, toward the shadows, toward the unknown. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment I was paralyzed, trapped between the desire to flee and the pull to move forward. I couldn't fight it much longer. A figure stepped forward from the darkness once again. It was tall, shrouded in mist, with eyes that glowed with a cold, unnatural light. The figure's mouth parted in a soundless scream, and the air grew so cold I could see my breath. My legs finally gave in. I ran. The forest tore at me, the twisted trees reaching out with their gnarled fingers. Every step was harder than the last. My breath came in ragged gasps, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, closing in from every angle. And then, in the distance, I saw it again, the light. Faint flickering, drawing me in. I pushed harder, faster, my vision narrowing, desperate to reach it. To escape. But as I neared, the light vanished once again, like a mirage. The ground trembled beneath me, and the darkness pressed in so tightly I could barely see. I stopped. I was lost. There was no way out anymore. And that is when I heard it, not in my ears, but in my very bones. Come home. The sound wasn't a voice. It was more like a vibration in the air, a pressure, a pull. My heart slammed against my ribs, the force of it nearly suffocating. The words, or whatever they were, didn't just echo in my ears. They reverberated deep inside me, in my chest, in my bones. Come home. I didn't want to. I couldn't. But it felt so overwhelming, so real, that for a split second I was unsure whether I was still standing in the forest or if I was already somewhere else, somewhere far worse. My vision blurred, a cold sweat drenched my skin, and I felt an icy chill crawl up my spine, settling in the back of my skull like a presence, breathing right behind me. The wind howled through the trees, an eerie wail that seemed to come from the very earth itself. I turned, instinctively looking for an escape, but every direction led to the same thing, shadows. Endless, twisting shapes that loomed over me, tall and thick like dark walls. The trees themselves had transformed into something alien. Their trunks were no longer just bark, they were veins, pulsating with a deep, unnatural rhythm. The forest felt alive, watching me. I could still feel the pull. My legs wavered beneath me, and though every part of me screamed to run, to flee, I was rooted to the spot. Something inside me wanted to obey. Something deep inside whispered that I belonged here. Come home. The figure emerged again, this time from the shadows of the trees. It was tall, too tall, its movement smooth, like it was drifting through water. But it wasn't the figure as height that chilled me. It was its eyes. Pale and gleaming, cold as ice, they pierced through the dark, locking onto me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. It was no longer a human shape, it was something beyond that, something not quite flesh, but something other. I felt my legs move forward before I could stop them. My body was betraying me. Every step was like a battle between my mind and my muscles, and with each one the pull grew stronger, my thoughts muddier. The trees seemed to shift, the branches curling toward me like skeletal hands, and the ground, soft beneath my feet, began to tremble again, as if it recognized me, as if it had been waiting. Please. I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was pleading for mercy or simply asking the darkness to let me understand. My breath came out in jagged gasps, but it didn't seem to matter. My voice was lost in the wind, swallowed by the forest. The figure spoke, but not with words. It was more like a ripple in the air, a sense of thought reaching out to me. You've always known your place. What did that mean? My mind was clouded. I struggled to focus, to fight against whatever was happening, but the pressure on my chest grew, squeezing the air from my lungs. I gasped for breath, but it came too shallow, too quick, as if the air itself had thickened, suffocating me with the weight of its darkness. I tried to move, to resist, but I was moving through sludge, every motion weighed down, each step heavier than the last. The ground beneath me wasn't earth anymore, it was something else, a cold, unnatural surface that stretched endlessly before me. I was walking on something that didn't belong, something that was neither solid nor liquid, but something in between. The figure reached toward me. Its hand was stretched out, fingers long and twisted like the roots of the trees, but they were moving with purpose, dragging through the air like they had a will of their own. The cold intensified, biting into my skin, the chill seeping into my very soul. It was pulling me in, drawing me toward it, but my legs wouldn't stop, wouldn't go back. They kept moving forward, closer to the figure. Closer to whatever it was. You are home. I shook my head violently, fighting to break free of the hold. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. My body refused to obey, but my mind was still mine, or at least I hoped it was. I tried to scream, to call out, but the sound caught in my throat, a hollow whisper. I felt like I was losing control of everything, my thoughts, my body, my very self. The trees bent further inward, the space narrowing around me. The figure's eyes gleamed brighter, the greenish light glowing stronger with every step I took. It was pulling me in. No, I wouldn't let it. I tried to tear my hand away from the cold air. I fought against the invisible force, but it was useless. The pull was too strong. And then I saw it, the cracks, the shifting, the glowing green light under the ground. The earth itself was beginning to open like a gaping wound, and something was stirring beneath it. Something ancient. Something that had waited for far too long. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, the figure stopped. The hand withdrew. The earth ceased trembling. The forest became silent, the whispering winds halting, leaving an oppressive stillness that smothered me. I stood there, frozen in place. What now? The darkness had swallowed everything, the trees, the ground, the sky, all of it. but in the midst of it, there was a tiny flicker of light. Something deep inside the forest, beyond the figures, beyond the glowing cracks in the earth. I turned toward it instinctively, my body no longer my own, compelled by the pull once more. My heart raced faster, pounding as if it wanted to break free from my chest. Come home. I took a step toward the flicker, but as soon as my foot moved, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell. The last thing I felt was the cold. A deep, inescapable cold. The kind that doesn't just freeze the body, but freezes the soul. And the last thing I heard was the whispering. Welcome home. I woke to silence. Not the soft, peaceful kind of silence that lulls you into a comfortable sleep, but the oppressive kind. The kind that presses down on your chest, filling your ears with a thick, almost suffocating quiet. My eyes opened, but the world before me was a blur of shadows. The blackness that surrounded me wasn't just darkness, it was like a heavy veil, thick and unyielding, cutting off any trace of light. I couldn't move at first. My body felt numb, frozen to the spot. My fingers trembled, and when I tried to push myself up, my palms sank into something cold, something soft, like damp earth or thick moss. My legs felt like stone, heavy and unresponsive. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, but my tongue felt like it had been coated with something foul. Where was I? The last thing I remembered was falling. The ground opening up beneath me. The flickering light. The whispers. I tried to focus, to take in my surroundings, but all I could see was the blackness stretching infinitely. There were no shapes, no familiar objects, nothing that could offer any comfort or grounding. Just emptiness. But then a sound broke through the quiet. A faint rustling. A soft, almost delicate sound, like something brushing against the earth, moving ever so slightly. My breath caught in my throat. It was a whisper. No, it was a voice. But it wasn't clear, distorted, fragmented, like 1,000 voices layered on top of each other. They spoke in a language I didn't understand. Words that twisted and curled into one another, a language older than time itself. It was like the earth itself was speaking, the very soil beneath me whispering its secrets. And then, in the midst of the swirling voices, I heard something clearer. A name. Emily. I froze. It was unmistakable. My name. But there was something off about the way it was spoken. It wasn't a voice filled with concern, with love. No. It was something cold, detached, like the wind calling my name just before a storm, foretelling something terrible. Emily. The whispering grew louder, the voices pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, feel the presence of whatever it was that was watching, waiting. It was like the very air was alive, thick with intent. I tried to move, tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. My feet remained planted in the soft, damp earth, as if the ground had taken root in my flesh. The more I struggled, the more the earth seemed to pull me down, like it was trying to consume me, to drag me into its depths. The whispering didn't stop. Come to us. The words curled around my mind like tendrils of smoke, slipping into my thoughts, wrapping themselves around my consciousness. There was a deep, gnawing pull in my chest, a force that was urging me to move. It was like my body wasn't my own anymore, like I was being guided by something darker, something far beyond my understanding. And then I heard the sound again. A rustle. A shift in the air. Something moving in the dark, just out of sight. I wanted to scream, but no sound left my throat. My mouth was dry, my body unwilling to betray me. The voices grew louder, more frantic, almost desperate. But I still couldn't see anything. There was nothing to focus on except the impenetrable blackness. And then I saw it. A flicker. A light in the distance. I blinked, my eyes straining, trying to focus. But the light wasn't like any light I had ever seen. It was sickly green, flickering like a dying flame, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched unnaturally. The moment it appeared, everything else seemed to retreat, like it was pulling the darkness toward itself, consuming it. Without thinking, my legs moved. I didn't want to, I fought against it, but my body refused to listen. It was like an invisible hand had grasped me, pulling me forward toward that flickering green glow. Every step I took felt heavy, like I was wading through thick mud, and yet I was being drawn closer, irresistibly closer. The light was so faint, so fragile, that I feared it would disappear if I got too close. But the voices, they urged me forward, the whispers now mixed with a deep, guttural hum, a sound so low and reverberating that I felt it in my chest. And then, just as I was about to reach out, the light vanished. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow and erratic. The light had simply gone, like it had never been there at all. The darkness, thick and impenetrable, was all that remained. The voices stopped. The air was still. I stood there for what felt like hours, my body trembling, unable to move, unable to breathe. There was no sound now, no light, no presence. Just me, alone, in the void. But then, the shift. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling. A pressure. A weight. Something watching me. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat, and that is when I saw it. A figure. Tall. Shrouded in the same thick darkness that had swallowed everything around me. It was standing at the edge of my vision, just barely there, like it was waiting for me to acknowledge it. The figure stepped forward, and with it, the darkness seemed to pulse, like it had a heartbeat, like the world itself was alive. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Its form was barely a shape-shifting, flickering in and out of existence like a mirage. And its eyes, those eyes, pale, cold, glowing with a sickly, unnatural light, fixed on me, piercing through the veil of darkness. "Welcome home, Emily." The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a command, a declaration, and I knew in that moment that it wasn't a question. It was a truth. What if every moment you lived was just a shadow of the past, and no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't escape it? I sat at the small wooden table, the fading light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the room. The house was quiet, too quiet. My hands rested on the table, fingers tapping nervously, as though the world around me was slowly unraveling. It had been like this for months, this incessant feeling of something pressing in from every side. Quiet dread that refused to leave me. The days blurred together. Each one felt like a repeat of the last, like I was trapped in an endless loop of waking and sleeping, always moving forward, but never really going anywhere. Time was slipping away, and yet I couldn't seem to grasp it. The past, it clung to me. It haunted me. I tried not to think about it, but it was impossible. The past was always there, lurking just behind my eyes. Sometimes, when I closed them, I could almost feel it like a presence in the room with me, watching, waiting. My breath would catch in my throat and my chest would tighten, like something unseen was pressing against me. The feeling never went away. It followed me, clung to me like an old, familiar coat heavy with memories. I reached for the cup of coffee beside me, the bitter warmth doing little to steady my nerves. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passing of time. Every second was like a countdown, a reminder of how much had been lost. I could hear the ticking even when I tried to focus on something else. It was a constant, relentless sound, echoing through the empty room. The house was old creaky floors, peeling paint, the smell of damp wood and dust. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and the more I stayed in this place, the more it felt like I was suffocating. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I couldn't bring myself to pack up and walk away from the memories, from everything that had happened here. I stood up, my legs a little unsteady. The room seemed to shift as though the walls were moving inward, the floor tilting beneath me. I tried to steady myself, but the disorientation only deepened. The house, it had always felt like this, like it was alive, watching me, pulling at the edges of my mind, making me doubt everything I thought I knew. I couldn't remember when it started. I couldn't remember how long it had been since things had felt normal. Was it weeks? Months? Longer? The days blended together, and with them, my thoughts. I tried to hold on to something, something to keep me grounded. But the more I tried, the more everything slipped through my fingers. The shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch, darkening, growing longer, as if they were moving toward me. I turned quickly, half expecting to see something lurking in the dark, but the room remained empty. My heart raced, my breath quickened. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things or if the house was truly changing. I glanced at the window, the last light of the day casting a faint orange glow across the horizon. But even that light seemed distant, out of reach. Like everything was fading, becoming less and less real. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. It was just the house, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The feeling had been growing stronger, gnawing at me. I couldn't shake it. Something was wrong, and I was afraid it always had been. As I walked toward the door, my fingers brushing the edge of the old wooden frame, a sudden noise startled me. It was faint at first, a whisper of something moving. A shift in the air. My heart skipped a beat. I turned quickly, scanning the room, but saw nothing. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive. But then I heard it again. A rustle. A faint sound, like footsteps on the creaky floorboards. My blood ran cold. Was someone else in the house? I swallowed hard, my hand frozen on the doorknob. I should leave. I should leave right now and never look back. But something held me there, something deep inside that told me I couldn't. I took a slow step backward, my eyes darting into the shadows once more. The sound, it wasn't just the wind. It wasn't just the house settling. It was something more. Something alive. My breath came in shallow gasps, and the silence around me seemed to stretch, as if the very air was thickening, closing in. I was never truly alone here. Not anymore. But what was it? What was his presence that lingered in every corner, in every creak of the floor? And more importantly, what did it want? I didn't want to know. But it seemed I had no choice. And as I stood there, frozen in the darkness of my own mind, I realized the truth. The curse was real. The room felt smaller than before. The shadows were no longer just dark corners. They had taken on a life of their own, curling and shifting along the walls like something tangible, something that could reach out and touch me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. But the air felt thick, suffocating, as though it was charged with static, with something waiting to spring to life. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, were growing closer. They echoed in the silence, creeping toward me, teasing me with their proximity. Was it my mind playing tricks again, or was there truly something in the room with me? I forced myself to take a step forward, my feet feeling heavy as though they were made of lead. Each movement felt like a decision, each breath a battle. The house was still. No, it wasn't still. It was watching me, waiting. I could almost feel the walls closing in on me, as if they were alive, pulsating with the same dread that gnawed at my insides. The door creaked behind me, and I flinched. It wasn't just the old wood, not this time. Something had caused it. A presence. A shift. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't stay. I needed to get out. I needed to leave. But even as I turned the doorknob, a sharp noise rang through the house, a loud, unmistakable crash. My heart leaped into my throat. Something had fallen, something heavy, and it wasn't far from me. I hesitated, my hand still on the door, the cold metal sending a shiver up my spine. The crash had come from upstairs. It was too close for comfort. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't let it go. What if it was someone? What if it was the answer to all this fear? Reluctantly, I stepped away from the door, my mind spinning, every sense heightened. Every creak of the floor beneath me sounded like thunder in my ears. As I made my way toward the staircase, the silence returned eerily still, but the air felt charged, tense, as though something unseen was watching me. With each step I took, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was just overreacting. But the unease I felt deep in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. I wasn't being paranoid. The house wasn't just old, it was wrong. It was as if it was alive, twisting and bending under its own weight. I reached the bottom of the stairs and hesitated, glancing up toward the landing. The house felt oppressive in a way that I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the dark corners, the creaking floorboards, or the silence. It was the feeling that I had been here before, like I was walking in a memory, and no matter how hard I tried to leave, it always pulled me back. I took another step. My breath was shallow, my body tense. There was no turning back now. I needed to see what was happening upstairs. The crash. It wasn't natural. The hallway stretched before me, its dim light casting a faint glow across the floor. The stairs groaned under my weight, but I didn't dare stop. I couldn't stop. Not until I found the source of that noise. As I reached the top of the stairs, the house seemed to breathe with me. The walls felt like they were pulsing, pressing in on me, and I couldn't tell if the feeling was real or just my mind playing tricks. The upstairs was colder than downstairs. A chill ran down my spine as I walked further down the hallway. The air was thick with dust, but there was something else in the smell, something sour, something I couldn't place. I paused in front of the door to the first bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and the room inside was dark. It had to be in there. The noise had come from there. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking, protesting against the movement. My heart raced, but I forced myself to look inside. The room was empty. The bed untouched. The window shut tight. The shadows in the corners were deep, darker than the rest of the room, but there was nothing else. I stepped back, breathing heavily, my mind racing. But then I saw it. A small object lying on the floor, just out of the corner of my eye. My pulse quickened as I moved toward it. It was a picture frame. I crouched down, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. The glass was cracked, spiderwebbed across the surface. The photo inside was old, the edges yellowed with age. It was a photo of me. I blinked, confusion washing over me. But there was something wrong with it, something I couldn't quite place. The image wasn't just old, it was wrong. I was younger, yes, but there was a look in my eyes, a darkness that shouldn't have been there. A look of someone who had seen something that shouldn't have, someone who had been touched by something unnatural. I dropped the frame in shock. It hit the floor with a loud crack. And then I heard it. A whisper. It was soft at first, like the rustling of paper, but it grew louder, sharper. It was a voice, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. You can escape. The air went cold. My breath came out in visible puffs. I turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. The darkness at the end of it seemed to stretch forever. The whisper, though, was still there. And it wasn't just in my ears. It was in my head. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My body was frozen. The whisper echoed, louder now, clearer. You can escape, the death's too late. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I didn't care what was behind me. I just needed to get away from that voice, from the house that had become something else. I slammed the bedroom door behind me, but the whisper followed me, creeping into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts like a vice. And then I realized I was never going to escape. I slammed the door shut with all the strength I could muster, my chest heaving as I leaned against it. The whispering didn't stop. It was like a shadow moving in my mind, a presence that wasn't just external, it had dug into my very thoughts. It's too late. You can escape. The words twisted and looped like a mantra, wearing me down. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to block it out, but the sound seemed to reverberate in the walls around me. I forced myself to take a step back from the door, my head spinning. I wasn't alone. I could feel it, the weight of something invisible, something that had been watching me for much longer than I had realized. It was in the air, in the walls, in the silence that now seemed unbearable. The room felt smaller, suffocating. It was the same bedroom I had seen earlier, but now it felt wrong. The shadows stretched longer than they should have. The air was too still, like the house itself was holding its breath. I looked around, my mind racing, desperate to make sense of what was happening. The old dresser, the fraying curtains, nothing seemed out of place. But there was something there, something I couldn't put my finger on. It was as if the room itself had become a trap, a cage for my mind. I stepped toward the window, the chill in the air biting at my skin. I pulled the curtain aside and glanced outside. The darkened landscape seemed endless, stretching far beyond where I could see. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees, but the sound seemed muted, as though the forest was keeping its distance. There was nothing out there, no sign of movement, but still, I felt it. That lingering presence. I couldn't stay in here. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in, and the whispers, always the whispers, growing louder. I had to find a way out. But where could I go? This house had become a maze, a shifting nightmare that had no clear exit. I turned back to the door, hesitated for a moment, then opened it slowly. The hallway stretched before me, eerily quiet, but the quiet wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. I stepped out, my footfalls heavy, each one echoing down the hallway, bouncing off the walls like a warning. The house was alive. I could feel it in the floorboards beneath me, in the flickering lights above me. It wasn't just the silence that unnerved me, it was the unnatural stillness. The crash from earlier echoed in my mind. Something had fallen. But what? My mind raced through the possibilities. What if it was someone in need of help? No, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a person. It wasn't just an accident. It was deliberate. Something or someone wanted me to hear it. Wanted me to find it. I reached the end of the hallway. The stairs were at the far end, their creaky steps leading to the ground floor. I knew I needed to go down there. Something was waiting for me, something I had to confront. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else, something watching me, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the house was alive, breathing, watching me with unseen eyes. It had become a predator, and I its prey. I turned the corner and stopped dead in my tracks. The door to the living room was wide open. I hadn't left it like that. My heart skipped a beat, my pulse quickening as I stepped toward it, unable to ignore the pull, the feeling that I had to know what was inside. The living room was dim, the only light coming from the flickering lamp in the corner. I hesitated at the doorway, my breath caught in my throat. Something about the room felt wrong. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as if the room itself had been waiting for me. And then I saw it. On the floor, near the old armchair, lay a small object. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized it. A photo. The same photo I had dropped earlier, the one from the upstairs bedroom. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. How could it be here? How could it have moved? I stepped forward slowly, my body stiff with fear, my mind screaming at me to turn and run. But I couldn't. I reached down, my hand trembling as I picked up the photo. This time, it was different. The glass was shattered, yes, but the photo itself was changed. It was me again, but my face wasn't the same. The eyes that stared back at me weren't mine. They were hollow, empty, like they had seen something so terrible, so dark, that it had stolen their humanity. And then I saw the message scrawled across the back of the frame. You were not alone. The whisper echoed in my mind once more, sharper now, clearer than ever before. You were not alone. It is too late to run. My pulse raced, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. The photo. The message. The feeling that I was being hunted by something unseen. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know how to escape. The house had become a living thing, and I was trapped inside it, a prisoner of its walls. I had to get out. I had to find a way to break free from this nightmare. But as I turned to leave the living room, the air seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, the lights flickered, and the shadows stretched further than they should have. Something moved behind me. I wasn't alone anymore. I froze. Every hair on my body stood on end, and I felt a deep, primal chill settle in my bones. I was no longer alone, I knew that much now. The thing in the shadows, whatever it was closer than I dared admit. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness. The faint hum of the flickering lamp was the only sound that dared disturb the silence. But even that seemed too loud, too intrusive. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting, watching. I turned slowly, every movement feeling like an eternity. The shadows in the corner of the room were thicker than they should be, more solid, as if they were absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. My pulse quickened with each passing second, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into them. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I stared into the darkness, unable to see what was lurking there, but knowing with every fibre of my being that something was. It was as though the room itself had come alive. The walls seemed to close in around me, the corners stretching, pulling away from my field of vision until the room felt infinitely larger and infinitely smaller at the same time. The floor beneath my feet creaked in protest as I shifted, too loud, too noticeable. But there was no escape. The thing in the shadows, whatever it was already here. And then I heard it. A soft sound, barely audible, but distinct. It was a low, guttural breathing, like something was trying to mask its presence but couldn't quite manage it. It was coming from the shadows from the corner near the window. A shift, an unnatural movement, and I could feel the air around me tremble with the weight of it. Something was there, something alive, something that shouldn't have been. I couldn't take my eyes off the corner, couldn't bring myself to look away even though I knew it was dangerous. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt rooted to the spot, like the floor itself was holding me there. A whisper so faint I thought I imagined it slipped into my ear, a voice that didn't come from anywhere and everywhere at once. You were not supposed to be here. I didn't know if I'd heard it or if it had come from my own tortured mind, but I knew it didn't matter. The room was becoming darker, the shadows more distinct, moving and writhing like living things. The oppressive weight of it, whatever it was, pressed down on me. I felt it in my chest, in my throat, squeezing the air from my lungs. Leave now. The voice, or perhaps the thought, was stronger this time. A pulse in my skull, vibrating through my body. I could feel its power, its insistence. But I was frozen, paralyzed by fear so deep I couldn't even scream. The longer I stood there, the closer the shadow became, creeping along the walls, moving toward me. And then, as though in response to the voice, I saw a figure. No, not a figure, a shape, something that couldn't be fully defined. It was there, standing just beyond the edge of the light, its features shifting in and out of focus. It was wrong, too wrong to be real. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its body seemed to contort unnaturally, bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its limbs, if they could even be called limbs, were long, grotesquely elongated, and ending in spindly, claw-like fingers that twitched as if waiting for something, waiting for me. It had no face, not in the way I understood faces. Where its head should have been was just empty space, a black void that seemed to swallow light. I couldn't look away. I had to look, even as it sent waves of nausea crashing through me. There was something deeply familiar about it, something that gnawed at the edges of my memory. It was like seeing a half-forgotten nightmare, one that had haunted me for years, but I couldn't quite recall. The thing took a step forward, then another. Its movement was jerky, not quite fluid, but deliberate. Each step made the air around me grow colder. Its presence was suffocating. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to run. I was trapped in the moment, trapped in its gaze, if it could even be called a gaze. The void where its face should have been seemed to pull at me, drag me deeper into its emptiness. You should have stayed away. The whisper came again, louder this time, reverberating in my mind and in the very bones of the house. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run, to get away from that presence, but my body refused to move. My mind screamed, but my legs remained rooted to the floor. It was almost as if the thing was feeding on my fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. Suddenly it lunged. The world exploded into a blur of motion. I barely had time to react as the air seemed to grow thick, heavy with the weight of the creature as presence. I stumbled backward, the ground shifting beneath me. I couldn't see. The shadows had taken over completely, swallowing the room. I was lost, disoriented, unable to find my bearings. I gasped for breath, but it felt like the air had turned to thick smoke, choking me, smothering me. I couldn't hear the sounds of my panic, couldn't see the room I had once known so well. I was blind, deaf, trapped in a place that wasn't real anymore. Or maybe it was real, and I was the one who was no longer real. The last thing I remembered before the darkness took me was the sound of its breathing coming closer. Ye were not alone. Then there was nothing. I woke up with a sharp gasp, my chest rising and falling as if I had been holding my breath for an eternity. My body was drenched in sweat, and for a moment I couldn't tell if I had just woken from a nightmare or if I had truly come back from the edge of something darker, something that still lingered in the air. I was lying on the cold wooden floor, the same floor I had stood on only moments, or was it hours? Before. The room was still, the oppressive silence hanging in the air like a heavy fog. But it felt different now. It felt wrong. The shadows, they were no longer just shadows. They were something else, something more. I scrambled to my feet, my legs unsteady, as if they hadn't fully remembered how to support me. I wiped the sweat from my brow, but it only seemed to make things worse. The air was thick, suffocating. I took a cautious step forward, trying to orient myself to grasp onto something that made sense. But nothing made sense anymore. The room I had once known, the place that was supposed to be a refuge, the place of familiarity, was now a distorted reflection of itself. The walls were slightly askew, as though the space had been stretched, pulled out of shape. The shadows didn't just cling to the corners now, they moved. They shifted. It was like they were alive, breathing in sync with me, following my every step. I swallowed hard, forcing my breathing to steady. No. I wouldn't let this place break me. I wouldn't let whatever that thing was control me. But the shadows were everywhere. They crept along the walls like fingers inching toward me, reaching, grasping. I could feel them at the edge of my vision, always present, always there. I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks on me or if something deeper, something more sinister, had truly changed the very fabric of reality around me. My pulse raced as I looked toward the door. The faintest sliver of light shone through the crack beneath it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the moment I crossed that threshold, I would be leaving one nightmare for another. Every part of me screamed to get out, to run far away from whatever was lurking in the darkness. But that thing in the shadows, it had touched me. It had reached inside me and left something behind. I wasn't sure if I could escape it anymore, no matter how far I ran. I approached the door, my steps slow, hesitant. I placed my hand on the handle and paused, closing my eyes for just a moment. The whisper of the voice that had echoed in my mind before, it was still there. I could hear it faintly, a murmur in the back of my thoughts. It wasn't quite words, but it was there, insistent, nagging, like an itch that I couldn't scratch. You were never truly alone. I opened the door. The hallway beyond was just as distorted as the room I had left behind. The light from the lamps flickered in a way that made the walls seem to bend and shift unnaturally. The sound of my footsteps was strangely muffled, as though the floor itself was trying to swallow the noise. It was hard to tell where the darkness ended and where the light began. It felt like I was walking through a world that was breaking apart at the seams, unraveling with each step. I turned a corner, the air growing colder as I ventured deeper into the house. But this was no longer a house. This was a place out of time, a place that existed on the edges of reality, twisted and warped by something dark. I could almost hear the very fabric of the world groaning under the weight of whatever force had claimed it. A sudden sound broke through the silence, soft but distinct. The faintest click of something shifting. My heart skipped in my chest, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I turned toward the sound, my breath catching in my throat. At the end of the hallway, the door stood slightly ajar. The door to the room where it all began. The room I had just fled from. The shadows within seemed to writhe and shift, too thick to see clearly but unmistakably moving, as if they were trying to escape, trying to reach me. I should have turned back. I should have run. But I couldn't. Not anymore. It was calling to me. Whatever was in that room, whatever had left its mark on me, was waiting. I stepped forward. As I approached the door, I felt the temperature drop even further, the cold wrapping around me like a vise. My skin prickled, my senses on high alert. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The room was the same almost. The furniture was arranged differently, the shadows deeper, more oppressive. But what caught my attention immediately was the mirror. It hadn't been there before. It stood against the far wall, its surface gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. I approached it cautiously. Something about the mirror seemed wrong. It wasn't just reflecting the room. It was twisting it. The reflection in the glass was subtly distorted, like the world was being pulled out of focus. And then I saw it. A figure standing just behind me. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but its shape. I knew it. It was the thing I had seen in the dark corner of the room earlier. It was there, its long, twisted limbs stretching out of the reflection and reaching toward me. I whipped around, but the room was empty. I was alone. Or at least I thought I was. The mirror didn't lie, though. It was still there, still reaching, still waiting. My breath came in shallow gasps as I realized what it meant. The thing hadn't left. It was in the reflection, but it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was here. And that was when I heard it. The voice, not in my head this time, but from behind me, soft and insistent. You can escape. The shadow reached out, and then everything went black. Oh, you made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.